What's up, people? It's DevSage here, and in this video I'm going to be teaching you about debouncing in JavaScript. What is debouncing? Debouncing is the process of making sure that some event handler does not bounce or does not fire multiple times within some short time window. So if I wanted to make sure that some handler, say a click handler or a scroll handler, to make sure that that doesn't trigger multiple times or too quickly, I can write a debouncer function to help with that. Some real world use cases for debouncing is, let's say I had built a form that one of my users is filling out, and I want to save changes on that form every once in a while, but only when the user is not actively typing or making changes to that form, because every save costs us a database trip. So we want to minimize the amount of saves on that form. You probably write a debouncer in order to avoid saving on every key press, for example. Or one of the more simple examples of where debouncing could come in handy is with double clicks. So let's say we have a payment form here, in this case just a payment button, and clicking on this button submits a $100 payment. Okay, cool. One of the problems that we can run into is, let's say the user double clicks on this button and looks like we got 3 $100 payments submitted messages here. Let's say we click on it 14 times, 15 times, all within that short time frame. Now the user obviously probably doesn't mean to submit or double click or triple click, and so you don't want to accidentally submit 2, 3, 4, 5 payments to the server in real life in a real production system. So what you might do to this kind of thing is you might write a debouncer function in order to basically prevent the click handler for this button from triggering too fast within some short time window. So let's get to looking at the code. Okay, so here we have the code. We have our script.js. Our index.html is relatively trivial. We just have the submit payment button and then the script import here. So we're actually just going to focus on the script. But all we have here is we are attaching a click event listener to the submit button. And when that button is clicked, it's going to run this handler, which basically just submits the $100 payment. And the way it's currently working is literally every time the button is clicked, it's going to always submit a payment. The way we can get around this is by writing a debouncer function that is basically going to wrap around the click handler. And the purpose of creating this debouncer wrapper function is to add a little bit of extra functionality in between the time the user actually clicks the button and the time that the handler runs. So right now the user clicks the button and the handler runs immediately, but we're going to add a debouncer wrapper to add a little bit more functionality in between that process in order to make a determination of, do we really want to trigger this click? Do we really want to trigger this handler? The way we do that, I'm going to get to that in a second, but that's just going to be the purpose of it. We're going to add some debouncing logic in between the actual event that happens, in this case a click, and the time that the handler runs, to make sure that we actually do want to run the handler. One thing we're going to do, let's move this handler out into its own function. So instead of doing it inline like this, let's create a function handler, and we're going to basically just pull it out like this. And now we can just reference it as such. Alright, so let's go down here and write our debouncer function. So we can go down here and say function debounce, and so let's do this. And the way we're going to actually use debounce is we're going to use it like this. We're going to basically call debounce and pass in the handler that we want to run whenever we click the button. So remember when I said debounce is basically a wrapper around whatever handler you want. So we're going to end up passing in the handler as an argument to debounce. and we're going to name that handler F for function. So debounce is actually going to take in a second argument, and this second argument is basically going to be the time window that you want to wait before you actually trigger this handler. And if that timer expires without any new events being triggered, okay, cool. The user didn't try to double click or triple click or anything like that. Let's run the handler. If the debouncer detects that the user tried to trigger that event again in that time window that you define, it's going to forget about all the times that you triggered the event in the past, and it's just going to focus on this last time that you triggered it, and it's going to restart the timer and try again until it gets to a point where the timer can successfully expire and it can run the handler. Okay, so we add our basically our time window here. We're going to add it in milliseconds, so we're going to call this argument ms, and let's go up here and let's say we're going to have a 500 millisecond time window. All right, so how do we actually implement the debouncer? How do we set our debouncer up so that it remembers or can keep track of basically the last time that a user triggered an event? So what we can do is we can use set timeout. So as you probably know, set timeout is a method that we can use to basically run a timer, and after that timer expires, we can run some callback function. So in this case, we have a set timeout, which is going to run a callback function after ms milliseconds, whatever milliseconds we pass in this case 500, it's going to run that callback function. And in this case, the callback function we want to run is the actual handler that we passed in to debounce in the first place, F. So we're going to go down here. Inside this callback function, we're going to run F. Okay, cool. So now let's do this. Let's, instead of running set timeout directly here, we're actually going to put this set timeout inside of another function. So we're going to say return function, and then we're going to, inside this function, run the set timeout. So why are we doing this? Why are we returning a function inside of a function? Well, the reason we have to do this is, remember, so add event listener, before what we had was add event listener click handler. So add event listener takes in a function reference as the second argument. With debounce, we have to make sure that whatever debounce returns is actually a function reference as well. So we can't just call set timeout because we have to return some kind of function reference. So that's why we have to basically return this function inside of debounce. What we're effectively doing is we're creating a closure. If you're familiar with closures, I have a video on closures if you don't know what a closure is, if you want to get a better understanding of that. But we're just creating a function that has a reference to its surrounding state, its surrounding scope, in order to basically satisfy the requirement that add event listener here has. So we're going to add this back. So now debounce is going to return a function reference. So everything's going to be good here. Okay, so debounce takes an event handler, takes in a time window. It's going to run that handler after ms milliseconds. Okay, cool. We're almost there. So how do we actually make sure that we can keep track of whether or not this timeout was already set, right? Because what we want to be able to do is, if we trigger a click and then later on in the future we trigger a click again, we basically want to reset this timer. So how do we basically remember if we set the timer in some previous call? So the way we can do that is set timeout actually returns a number, and the number that it returns is basically the ID of the timeout that you just set. Whenever a set timeout is triggered, an ID gets assigned to it, and If at any point during the timer phase, if you want to say cancel that timer, you can just pass in this timer ID to the clear timeout method, and it'll stop it. It'll say, you know that timeout I set before? I want you to cancel that. So we have this ID available to us in order to basically keep track of whether or not a timeout has been queued already. So we can take advantage of that by basically storing this in a timeout variable. So this timeout variable here is basically going to store the ID of this set timeout. Okay, cool. But this isn't quite right. So instead of having let timeout be defined inside of the inner function, inside of the handler basically, we really want the debouncer function itself to maintain the reference to the timeout variable. Because we really want to maintain one instance or one reference to timeout, and we're going to assign it every time we call a new handler or call a new click handler in this case. But we want the debouncer to be able to remember it from one click to another. Okay, cool. So we're almost done. Now what we have to do is we have to go inside of the inner function, inside of the handler basically, and we need to check to see if timeout is already set. So if we get to this point, if timeout has already been set, that means there has already been a click event that's happened in the past and it hasn't been cleared out yet. So we're trying to trigger a new event too quickly, because what happens is, and I might not have made this clear earlier, but when set timeout runs and the timer expires successfully, the timeout value is going to get cleared out automatically. So if we come to a point where we call set timeout in click A, for example, and we try to trigger another click and the timeout is still set, that means it hasn't expired from the first time that we called set timeout. So what we want to do is we want to basically forget about the first time we tried to trigger it by doing a clear timeout and passing in the timeout ID. And that's pretty much it for a debouncer. So I'll go through it in summary. So we have a debouncer function that's going to be a wrapper around the actual handler that you want to run, and it's going to take in some time frame, some time window, and if an event is triggered, the debouncer is going to wait until that time window expires. And if you don't get any more events of the same type within that time window, the debouncer will go ahead and run the handler. But in the event that the user triggers a click, a new set timeout is going to get queued, and then sometime in the future the debouncer detects another event coming in, but the timeout from the first event hasn't cleared out yet. Well, what it's going to do is it's going to forget about the first time it queued that event, and it's just going to re-queue it, and hopefully that no other interruptions are going to come in, but it's basically just going to restart the timer to queue that handler for sometime in the future. All right, so let's see this in action. All right, so here we are with our submit payment button again. And if you remember from the first time, whenever we clicked submit payment, it would always trigger another payment submission. So let's see how it behaves now. So let's click submit payment. And as you can see, you may or may not have caught it, but I clicked submit payment and there was just a tiny delay before it actually printed out a $100 payment submitted. And that's coming from the half a second delay that we added with our debouncer logic. So if I click this again, you might be able to see it. So yeah, kind of a delay again. But if I refresh this, let's try double clicking this. So if I double click this, you can see that we only got one payment submission here. That's because our debouncer is basically preventing that double click. If I double click within that 500 millisecond time window, it's going to ignore that first click and it's going to restart the timer from the second click. So let's say I triple clicked as you can see, I only got one more payment submission. So if I do something like click and I just keep clicking, right now the debouncer is constantly resetting that 500 millisecond timer, and it's going to forget about all the previous clicks, and it's only going to care about the last click I make. And once I make that last click and I wait 500 milliseconds, it's going to issue that payment submission. So that is a little bit about how debouncers work. I know this was probably a little bit confusing because it introduces the concept of closures and wrapper functions and stuff like that. But if you go back and rewatch it, I hope you'll get a better understanding of how debouncing works. But if you like this video, leave a like. Be sure to leave a comment. Subscribe if you want to see more web dev made simple. And yeah, peace.